The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana plains when ranch foreman Jake Sullivan made a discovery that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his most trusted worker. For 3 years, Sam had been the best ranch hand he'd ever hired, strong, reliable, never complained about the brutal work or endless hours. But as Jake burst through the barn doors that September morning, following the sound of desperate cries, he found Sam collapsed in the hay, clutching something small and crying against their chest. It wasn't until Jake stepped closer that he realized what he was looking at. Sam wasn't just hurt, Sam was giving birth. And Sam wasn't a boy at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years earlier, September 1899, the freight train wheezed to a stop at Copper Ridge Station like a dying animal, black smoke bleeding into the crisp Montana sky. Passengers stumbled onto the weathered platform, shaking dust from their clothes and squinting against the afternoon glare. Most were men miners heading to the copper claims, drifters chasing rumors of work, cattle buyers with sharp eyes and softer hands. Among them, a slight figure in oversized clothes shouldered a canvas pack and pulled a worn hat low over dark eyes. The name sewn into the inside of the coat read Samuel Parker, but the fingers that gripped the train ticket trembled like autumn leaves. Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore had been dead for 3 days now, buried in a shallow grave beside the railroad tracks 200 miles east. In her place stood Sam Parker, a 17-year-old boy with no family, no history, and nothing to lose. The transformation had taken her 2 weeks to perfect, cutting her auburn hair with kitchen scissors until it hung ragged around her ears, binding her chest with strips of cotton until she could barely breathe, practicing a lower voice until her throat ached. The plan was simple: disappear into the vast Montana territory where no one knew Sarah Whitmore had ever existed. Find work, survive, and never look back at the life that had crumbled around her like a house built on sand. But standing on that platform, watching men spit tobacco juice into the dirt and size up newcomers like livestock, Sarah felt the full weight of what she'd attempted. She'd read about women passing as men in dime novels, but those were stories. This was real. The way these men moved, talked, stood, the casual violence in their laughter. The way they looked right through anything they considered weak. A hand clapped down on her shoulder, nearly sending her stumbling. "You look lost, boy." The voice belonged to a mountain of a man with graying whiskers and eyes like chips of granite. He wore a battered Stetson and a leather vest that had seen better decades. "Name's Bull Morrison. You looking for work?" Sarah's practiced voice came out rougher than intended. "Yes, sir. I can work." Bull studied her with the same attention he might give a horse he was considering buying. "You ever worked cattle?" "Some." The lie came easier than she'd expected. "Back in Kansas." "Kansas, huh?" Bull spat into the dirt. "Well, this ain't Kansas, boy. This is Montana, and Montana don't suffer fools or weaklings. But if you're willing to learn and you ain't afraid of honest work, I might know a place." He gestured toward a weathered wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. "Jake Sullivan runs the Triple S Ranch about 20 miles north. Good man, fair wages, but he works his hands hard. Lost 2 men last month. One got himself kicked by a bull. The other decided he preferred saloon life to ranch life." Sarah felt her heart hammering against the cotton binding her chest. This was it. The moment that would determine whether her desperate gamble would pay off or leave her exposed and vulnerable. "I'm not afraid of hard work," she said, meeting Bull's gaze directly. Something in her tone must have convinced him, because he nodded toward the wagon. "Climb up. I'll take you out there. But understand this, boy, if Jake don't like what he sees, you'll be walking back to town before sunset." The ride to the Triple S Ranch gave Sarah her first real taste of Montana's brutal beauty. Rolling grasslands, stretched endlessly under a sky so vast it made her feel like a speck of dust. Mountains rose in the distance like sleeping giants, their peaks already dusted with early snow. The silence was absolute except for the creak of wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of hooves. Bull wasn't much for conversation, which suited Sarah fine. She used the time to study the landscape, trying to imagine herself surviving in this harsh wilderness. Every few miles, they passed other ranches' clusters of weathered buildings, huddled against the elements like refugees from civilization. "That's the Henderson place," Bull said, pointing to a spread of barns and corrals. "Good people, but they've had troubles. Rustlers hit them twice this summer. Out here, a man's got to be ready to protect what's his." As they crested a low hill, the Triple S Ranch spread out before them like something from a painting. The main house was built of honey-colored logs, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Behind it stood a massive barn, several smaller outbuildings, and a network of corrals that seemed to stretch forever. Cattle dotted the pastures like scattered stones, and Sarah could see riders moving among them with the easy grace of men who lived in the saddle. "There's Jake now," Bull said, pointing to a figure near the main corral. Jake Sullivan was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in his early 30s, with sun-streaked brown hair and the kind of lean, rangy build that spoke of years spent working cattle. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested every gesture had a purpose. When he looked up at the approaching wagon, his eyes were the color of winter sky pale blue and sharp enough to cut glass. "Bull," he called out, walking over as they pulled up. "What brings you out my way?" "Brought you a potential hand," Bull replied, jerking his thumb toward Sarah. "Boy says he's got experience with cattle." Jake's gaze shifted to Sarah, and she felt those pale eyes taking her measure. She forced herself to sit straighter, to meet his stare without flinching. This was the test, not just of her physical appearance, but of her ability to project the kind of quiet confidence these men expected from each other. "You got a name?" Jake asked. "Sam Parker." The words came out steady, natural. "I'm looking for steady work." Jake stepped closer, and Sarah caught the scent of leather and horses and something clean like pine soap. "You look young." "How old are you?" 18. Another lie, but delivered without hesitation. "Where you from?" "Kansas. Worked on my uncle's ranch until he died. Place got sold." Jake nodded slowly, and Sarah realized he was studying more than just her face. His eyes took in her hands. She deliberately roughened them over the past weeks, creating calluses and small scars that might convince someone she'd worked hard labor. He noted her posture, the way she sat the wagon seat, even how she held the reins. "You ever break horses?" he asked. Sarah's heart skipped. This was dangerous territory, claiming skills she didn't possess could get her seriously hurt or killed. But backing down might cost her the job entirely. "Some," she said carefully. "Nothing too wild. Can you ride?" "Yes, sir." Jake was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah held her breath. Finally, he stepped back and nodded to Bull. "Thanks for bringing them out. I'll take it from here." Bull tipped his hat and climbed back onto the wagon. "Good luck, boy," he said to Sarah. "You'll need it." As the wagon rolled away, Sarah found herself alone with Jake Sullivan for the first time. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, and she waited for him to speak first, instinctively understanding that showing too much eagerness would mark her as desperate. "Come on," Jake said finally. "Let's see what you can do." He led her toward the barn, and Sarah marveled at the sheer size of the operation. The barn itself was larger than most buildings she'd ever seen, with stalls for dozens of horses and enough hay stored in the loft to feed an army. The smell of horses and leather and oiled wood created an atmosphere that was both foreign and oddly comforting. "That's Thunder," Jake said, pointing to a massive black gelding in one of the stalls. "He's got spirit, but he's not mean. Can you saddle him?" Sarah approached the horse carefully, extending her hand for him to sniff before reaching for the halter. She'd watched men saddle horses countless times, but actually doing it while Jake's critical gaze burned into her back was entirely different. Her hands shook slightly as she fitted the bit, and she had to try twice to get the saddle positioned correctly. Thunder snorted and shifted his weight, and for a terrifying moment, Sarah thought he might bolt. But she spoke to him in low, soothing tones, the same voice she'd once used to calm skittish barn cats, and gradually he settled. "Not bad," Jake said when she'd finished. "Your uncle teach you that?" "Yes, sir." The fictional uncle was becoming more real with each lie she told about him. "Mount up. Let's see how you sit a horse." Sarah's throat went dry. She'd ridden before, but always side saddle, the way proper young ladies were expected to ride. She'd never straddled a horse like a man, never ridden astride with confidence and authority. But there was no backing down now. She grabbed the saddle horn and swung herself up, grateful that her weeks of practice had given her enough confidence to make the motion look natural. Thunder shifted beneath her, testing this new rider, and Sarah gripped with her knees the way she'd seen men do. "Take him around the corral," Jake instructed. "Nice and easy." The next few minutes were the longest of Sarah's life. Every step the horse took felt precarious, as if she might slide off at any moment and expose herself as a fraud. But gradually some deep instinct seemed to take over. She found herself moving with Thunder's rhythm, anticipating his movements, guiding him with subtle pressure from her legs and gentle pulls on the reins. When she brought him back to where Jake waited, she thought she saw something that might have been approval in his pale eyes. "You'll do," he said simply. "Bunkhouse is over there. Supper's at 6, work starts at dawn. You'll get $25 a month plus room and board. Questions?" Sarah shook her head, not trusting her voice. $25 was more money than she'd ever seen at one time. "One more thing," Jake added as she dismounted. "I run a clean operation here. No drinking, no gambling, no fighting. You cause trouble, you're gone. You steal from me or mistreat the animals, you're gone. You don't pull your weight, you're gone. We understand each other?" "Yes, sir." Jake studied her face one more time, and Sarah had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her carefully constructed disguise. But all he said was, "Welcome to the Triple S, Sam Parker." As she walked toward the bunkhouse with her pack slung over her shoulder, Sarah felt a mixture of triumph and terror that left her dizzy. She'd done it. She'd convinced Jake Sullivan to hire her. But as she looked around at the vast ranch that would be her home, she realized that the hardest part was just beginning. She would have to live as Sam Parker every day, every hour. She would have to work alongside men who would despise her if they discovered her secret. She would have to be stronger, tougher, and more determined than she'd ever been in her life. What she couldn't know, as she pushed open the bunkhouse door and stepped into her new existence, was that Jake Sullivan's pale blue eyes had noticed something about the way she moved. Something that would nag at the back of his mind for the next 3 years. Something he couldn't quite name, but couldn't quite forget either. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The bunkhouse smelled of sweat, tobacco, and decades of hard-living men. Sarah pushed through the heavy wooden door to find herself face to face with 5 pairs of curious eyes. The ranch hands had clearly been discussing her arrival, and the sudden silence that fell over the room felt thick enough to cut with a knife. "Well, well," drawled a voice from the corner. "Look what the cat dragged in." The speaker was a lean man with prematurely gray hair and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He sat on his bunk, cleaning a revolver with the methodical precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. His eyes were the flat gray of a winter sky, and they studied Sarah with the same detached interest A scientist might show a specimen under glass. "Name's Colt Brennan," he said, not bothering to look up from his weapon. "I'm the senior hand here, which means what I say goes when Jake ain't around." Sarah nodded carefully, sensing the challenge in his tone. "Sam Parker, pleased to meet you." Colt finally looked up, and Sarah felt those gray eyes taking inventory of everything from her boots to her hat. "Kansas, right? That's what Jake said." "That's right." "Funny thing about Kansas boys," Colt said, setting his gun aside and standing up. He was taller than Sarah had expected, probably 6 feet, with the kind of wiry strength that came from years of wrestling cattle and breaking horses. They tend to be either real tough or real soft. "Haven't figured out which one you are yet." Before Sarah could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Leave the kid alone, Colt. He just got here." This came from a bear of a man seated near the pot-bellied stove. He had shoulders like an ox and hands that looked like they could crush rocks. But his eyes were kind, and when he smiled, Sarah saw genuine warmth there. "I'm Marcus Washington," he said, standing and extending one of those massive hands. "Don't mind Colt. He's suspicious of everybody until they prove themselves." Sarah shook his hand, trying not to wince at the bone-crushing grip. "Nice to meet you," Marcus gestured around the room. "That's Tommy Chun over there by the window. Best horse handler in 3 counties, though he don't speak much English. Next to him is Eddie Kowalski, we call him Polish Eddie, and the young fella on the end bunk is Billy Garrett. He's been here about 6 months." Each man nodded as he was introduced, and Sarah tried to memorize their faces and names. These would be her companions for the foreseeable future, the men she'd have to fool every single day. Tommy Chun was small and compact, with intelligent dark eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime working with horses. He smiled shyly when introduced but said nothing. Polish Eddie was somewhere in his 40s, with a thick mustache and laugh lines around his eyes. He had the look of a man who enjoyed life despite its hardships. When he spoke, his accent was thick but understandable. "Welcome, young Sam. You picked good time to come. We are short-handed since Rusty got himself trampled." Billy Garrett couldn't have been much older than Sarah herself, with sandy hair and freckles that made him look even younger. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with a piece of rope as he nodded hello. "Your bunk's over there," Marcus said, pointing to an empty cot near the wall. "Trunk underneath for your gear. We eat breakfast at 5, start work at first light. Hope you're an early riser." Sarah walked over to the assigned bunk, hyper-aware of how the other men watched her movements. The mattress was thin and lumpy, but it was better than sleeping on the ground, which she'd done more than once during her journey to Montana. As she unpacked her meager belongings into the wooden trunk, she overheard Colt talking quietly to Polish Eddie. "Kid's got soft hands for a ranch worker," Colt was saying. "And did you see how he mounted that horse? Took him 2 tries to get the stirrup right." "Maybe he is just nervous," Eddie replied. "First day, new place. You remember how scared Billy was when he showed up?" Billy was scared, but he knew which end of a horse to feed. "This kid." Colt's voice trailed off, but Sarah could feel his suspicious gaze boring into her back. She forced herself to move naturally, to hang her spare shirt on the peg beside the bunk, as if she'd done it 100 times before. But inside, her heart was racing. If Colt was already suspicious after just an hour, how long before he started asking the kind of questions that could destroy her carefully constructed identity? "Supper bell ring in about an hour," Marcus said, settling back onto his bunk with a battered book. "Cookie makes the best biscuits this side of Denver, so don't be late." The next hour passed slowly. Sarah sat on her bunk, pretending to read a worn copy of a dime novel while actually listening to the conversations around her. She learned that cattle prices were down, that there'd been trouble with rustlers in the neighboring county, and that Jake Sullivan had a reputation as one of the fairest bosses in Montana Territory. Man pays on time, don't cheat nobody, and he'll back his men in a fight, Polish Eddie was explaining to Billy, but he don't tolerate laziness or lying. You cross Jake Sullivan, you better be ready to find work someplace else. When the supper bell finally rang, Sarah followed the other men across the yard to the main house. The dining room was spacious but simple, with a long wooden table that could seat a dozen men. Jake sat at the head with the ranch hands arranged. Along both sides, the cook, a grizzled man they called Cookie, emerged from the kitchen carrying platters of beef, potatoes, and those promised biscuits. He was missing 3 fingers on his left hand and had a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush, but the food smelled incredible. New boy gets first helping, Cookie announced, slapping a huge portion of beef onto Sarah's plate. Need to put some meat on them bones. Sarah mumbled her thanks and tried not to think about how the heavy meal would sit in her stomach when she was already nervous enough to be sick. Around the table, conversation flowed easily between the men. They discussed the day's work, plans for tomorrow, and shared news from town. Jake spoke little during the meal, but Sarah noticed he was watching everyone, taking the temperature of his crew. When his pale blue eyes settled on her, she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. Sam, he said finally, Marcus will take you out with the morning crew tomorrow. We're moving the west herd to better grazing. Think you can handle a day in the saddle? Yes, sir, Sarah replied, though the thought of spending 8 hours on horseback made her back ache in anticipation. Good. Colt, I want you to check the fence line near Willow Creek. Someone reported seeing riders over that way yesterday. Colt nodded grimly. Rustlers? Maybe. Or maybe just drifters. Either way, I want to know about it. After supper, the men returned to the bunkhouse. Some played cards, others read or wrote letters. Sarah excused herself early, claiming exhaustion from travel. In truth, she needed time alone to process everything that had happened and prepare for the challenges ahead. Lying in her narrow bunk, listening to the quiet conversations and occasional snores of the other men, Sarah felt the full weight of her deception settling over her like a heavy blanket. She'd managed to get through one day, but how many more lay ahead? And what would happen when the inevitable challenges arose, the physical tests? The moments when her ignorance of ranch work became obvious, the simple daily intimacies of living among men who expected her to be one of them. She thought about the way Colt had looked at her, the suspicion in his gray eyes. He would be watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. And what about Jake Sullivan? There had been something in his expression during supper, a thoughtfulness, that suggested he was forming opinions about his newest employee. But it was Marcus who surprised her most. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard his deep voice speaking quietly from the next bunk. Sam, you awake? Yeah, she whispered back. Don't let Colt get to you. He's been here longer than anybody except Jake, and he thinks that gives him the right to test every new man. Just do your work, keep your head down, and you'll be fine. Thanks, Marcus. One more thing, he said, and she could hear something different in his tone now, something more serious. I don't know what brought you out here, and I ain't asking. But Montana's got a way of stripping a man down to what he really is. Whatever you're running from, whatever you're hiding, and we're all hiding something, this place will find it eventually. Just make sure you're ready when it does. Sarah's blood went cold. Did Marcus suspect something? Or was he just offering the kind of general wisdom that older men gave to younger ones? She lay awake for a long time after that, staring at the ceiling beams and listening to the wind whistle around the corners of the building. Outside, she could hear the distant lowing of cattle and the occasional whinny of a horse. These were the sounds of her new world, and she would have to learn to find comfort in them. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, one thought kept circling through her mind. Marcus was right. Montana would strip her down to what she really was. The question was whether she was strong enough to survive the process. and whether the person she became would still be recognizable when it was over. In his own quarters in the main house, Jake Sullivan sat by his bedroom window, looking out over the moonlit ranch yard. Something about the new hire bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The kid claimed to have ranch experience, but there was something careful about his movements, something practiced rather than natural. Jake had built his reputation on being a good judge of character, and Sam Parker didn't quite add up. But Montana was full of men with secrets, men running from something or someone. As long as they did their work and didn't cause trouble, Jake had learned not to ask too many questions. Still, he made a mental note to keep an eye on the boy. In his experience, secrets had a way of revealing themselves when you least expected them. And on a ranch where trust between men could mean the difference between life and death, secrets could be dangerous things indeed. The morning star was still visible when the bunkhouse erupted in activity. Sarah jerked awake to the sound of boots hitting floorboards and men grumbling about the cold. Through the frosted windows, she could see that dawn was still an hour away, but the ranch was already coming alive. "Rise and shine, Kansas," Colt's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Time to see what you're really made of." Sarah rolled out of her bunk, her muscles protesting from the previous day's tension. Around her, the other men moved with the practiced efficiency of soldiers, pulling on boots, strapping on gun belts, and grabbing gear from pegs on the wall. She tried to mirror their movements, but everything felt awkward and uncertain. Marcus appeared beside her, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "First week's always the hardest," he said quietly. "Your body's got to learn a whole new way of living." The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and Sarah felt it burning down her throat like liquid fire. But the warmth was welcome in the pre-dawn chill, and she found herself grateful for Marcus's quiet kindness. Breakfast was a hurried affair: bacon, eggs and biscuits consumed standing up while Cookie barked orders about not dripping grease on his clean floor. Jake appeared as they were finishing, already dressed for a day in the saddle, his pale eyes alert despite the early hour. "Marcus, take Sam and Billy with you to move the west herd," he instructed. "Colt, I want you and Eddie to ride the north fence. Tommy, you're with me checking the water holes." As they walked toward the corral, Marcus fell into step beside Sarah. "Moving cattle ain't like riding a gentle horse around a corral," he said. "These animals got minds of their own, and some of them would rather stomp you than look at you. You stay close to me and Billy today, watch what we do, and try not to get yourself killed." The horses were already saddled and waiting. Sarah recognized Thunder from the previous day, but Marcus pointed her toward a smaller chestnut mare. "That's Copper," he said. "She's got a good temperament and knows cattle work. Let her do most of the thinking until you get the hang of it." Billy. Garrett was checking his saddle cinch with the nervous intensity of someone still proving himself. When he saw Sarah approaching, he offered a shy smile. "Your first cattle drive?" he asked. "Yeah," Sarah admitted. "Any advice?" "Don't ride directly behind them," Billy said seriously. "And if they start running, get out of the way first and ask questions later." The ride to the west pasture took them across 3 miles of rolling grassland. The sun was just cresting the mountains when they topped a ridge and saw the herd spread out below them, about 200 head of cattle, grazing peacefully in the morning mist. "Beautiful sight," Marcus said, reining in his horse. "But don't let them fool you. Cattle are prey animals, which means they spook easy and think later. Our job is to convince them to move where we want them to go without starting a stampede." He pointed to various landmarks around the pasture. "We're going to push them north to that valley between those 2 hills. Better grass up there, and it's closer to water. Sarah, you take the left flank. Billy, you're on the right. I'll work the back end and get them started." What followed was the most intense 3 hours of Sarah's life. Moving cattle, she quickly discovered, was like trying to herd giant, stubborn cats with horns. Just when she thought she had a group moving in the right direction, a few would peel off and head back, toward the original pasture. Others would stop to graze just when momentum was building. Copper seemed to understand the work instinctively, responding to the movements of the cattle before Sarah even saw them. But there were moments when Sarah had to make split-second decisions. And more than once she guessed wrong. "No, no." Billy shouted when Sarah tried to block a group of cattle from breaking away. "Let them go around. If you crowd them too tight, they'll bolt." But it was the big red bull that nearly ended her masquerade before it truly began. She was working the left side of the herd, trying to keep a group of cows from wandering toward a creek, when she heard Marcus shout a warning. She turned to see 2,000 pounds of angry bull charging directly toward her, head lowered, eyes rolled back. White dot training and instinct warred in Sarah's mind for a crucial split second. Everything she'd ever been taught as a lady said to scream, to freeze, to wait for rescue. But Sam Parker wouldn't do that. Sam Parker would act. She wheeled Copper hard to the right, feeling the mare's muscles bunch as they dodged the bulls. Charged by mere inches. The animal thundered past, close enough that she could smell its musk and feel the heat from its body. But instead of running, Sarah found herself turning Copper back toward the bull, following Marcus's shouted instructions. "Stay with him. Don't let him get back to the herd." For the next 10 minutes, Sarah found herself in a deadly dance with the bull. Every time he tried to circle back toward the other cattle, she was there, blocking his path, forcing him to move in the direction they wanted. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time, and when the bull finally gave up and trotted docilely toward the new pasture, Sarah felt a surge of triumph unlike anything she'd ever experienced. "Well, I'll be damned," Marcus said, riding up beside her. "That was some nice work, Kansas. Thought for sure you were going to end up decorating his horns." Billy was staring at her with obvious admiration. "I've been here 6 months and I still run from the big ones," he admitted, but it was the look on Marcus's face that worried. "Sarah." He was studying her with a thoughtfulness that made her stomach clench. She'd proven she could handle cattle. But had she acted too much like someone with natural instincts rather than learned skills? "Where'd you say you worked in Kansas?" Marcus asked casually. "My uncle's place," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Small operation, maybe 50 head. Uh-huh." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Your uncle teach you to read cattle like that? Because what you just did with that bull, that's not something you learn from books." Sarah felt sweat trickling down her back, despite the cool morning air. "Guess I just got lucky." "Maybe," Marcus said, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. They spent the rest of the morning getting the cattle settled in their new pasture, checking the fence line, and making sure the water sources were adequate. It was hard, physical work, but Sarah found herself falling into the rhythm of it. There was something deeply satisfying about working with the animals and the land, about being part of something larger than herself. But as they rode back toward the ranch, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd crossed some kind of invisible line. The incident with the bull had been a test, and while she'd passed it, she'd also revealed capabilities that didn't quite match her carefully constructed backstory. Back at the ranch, word of the morning's events had already spread. Colt was waiting in the corral when they returned, his gray eyes fixed on Sarah with renewed interest. "Heard you had some excitement with Red Devil," he said, referring to the bull by his nickname. "Just doing my job," Sarah replied, trying to project the kind of casual confidence she'd seen in the other men. "Red Devil's put 3 men in the hospital in the past 2 years," Colt continued. "Yet a green kid from Kansas handles him like he's been doing it all his life. That's interesting." Before Sarah could respond, Jake Sullivan appeared from the barn. "How'd the new hand do?" he asked Marcus. "Better than expected," Marcus replied carefully. "Kid's got good instincts." Jake's pale eyes settled on Sarah, and she felt that familiar sensation of being measured and weighed. "That's good to hear. We'll see how those instincts hold up over time." That evening, as the men gathered for supper, Sarah found herself the center of more attention than she was comfortable with. Stories of her encounter with Red Devil had grown in the telling, and several of the hands who hadn't been there wanted to hear details. "I heard you stared him down like you weren't scared at all," Polish Eddie said admiringly. "Fear keeps you alive," Sarah replied, remembering something she'd heard Marcus say. "But you can't let it paralyze you." Cookie served up a celebration meal of sorts, beefsteak and fresh-baked pie, and declared that any man who could handle Red Devil deserved extra portions. But Sarah noticed that both Jake and Colt remained quiet during the festivities, watching rather than participating. Later that night, as the bunkhouse settled into its evening routine, Sarah lay on her narrow cot thinking about the day's events. She'd proven she could do the work, but in doing so, she'd also raised questions about her background and experience. How many more tests would there be? How many more times would she have to choose between maintaining her cover and proving her capabilities? Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, and the sound sent a shiver down her spine. Montana was stripping her down, just as Marcus had warned. But instead of revealing weakness, it seemed to be uncovering strengths she'd never known she possessed. Question was whether those strengths would be enough to sustain her deception, or whether they would ultimately be what exposed her as she drifted towards sleep. Sarah thought about the moment when Red Devil had charged toward her. For just an instant, she'd forgotten to be afraid, forgotten to think about what a lady should do. She'd simply acted on instinct, and it had saved her life. Maybe survival in this harsh land wasn't about maintaining a perfect disguise. Maybe it was about becoming someone new entirely, someone who could face down charging bulls and earn the respect of hard men. Someone who could be strong enough to protect the secret that had brought her here. But in the main house, Jake Sullivan sat at his desk, writing in a leather-bound journal he kept of ranch activities. Under the entry for the day's date, he wrote, "New hand Sam Parker showed unusual skill with difficult cattle. Background story may need verification. Continue observation." And in the bunkhouse, as the other men slept, Colt Brennan lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about the way the new kid had moved when that bull charged. There had been something almost graceful about it, something that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place, but he would figure it out eventually. Colt Brennan always did. 2 months later, November 1899, the first blizzard of the season struck without warning, turning the Montana sky the color of lead and driving snow horizontally across the plains like frozen bullets. Sarah huddled deeper into her coat as she and Tommy Chun fought to get the horses into the barn before the storm worsened. The wind was so fierce it was difficult to stand upright, and visibility had dropped to mere yards. "Last one," Tommy shouted. Over the howling wind, pointing to a bay gelding that was stubbornly refusing to leave the shelter of the lean dash to dot, Sarah grabbed a lead rope and approached the frightened animal carefully. Horses could sense bad weather better than humans, and this one was clearly terrified by what was coming. As she reached for his halter, a particularly violent gust of wind caught her off balance, and she stumbled forward. The movement was too quick, too uncontrolled. Her carefully practiced masculine stride faltered, and for just a moment, her natural grace showed through the way a woman moves when she thinks no one is watching. Tommy's dark eyes caught the slip, and Sarah saw something shift in his expression. He'd been watching her more carefully lately, she'd noticed. The quiet horse handler missed very little, despite his limited English. "Come on, boy," she said gruffly, overcompensating with an exaggerated masculine tone as she successfully got the horse moving toward the barn. But the damage was done. As they secured the last of the animals and barred the barn doors against the storm, Sarah caught Tommy studying her with a thoughtfulness that made her stomach twist with anxiety. Inside the bunkhouse, the atmosphere was tense with the kind of cabin fever that came with being trapped indoors. The storm had been raging for 3 days, and tempers were beginning to fray. Cards had been played until everyone was sick of them, Stories had been told and retold, and the walls seemed to be closing in. Colt sat on his bunk, methodically cleaning his rifle for the third time that day. His gray eyes kept flicking toward Sarah, and she could feel the weight of his suspicion like a physical presence in the room. "You're awful neat for a ranch hand," he said suddenly. Breaking the afternoon silence. Sarah looked up from the book she'd been pretending to read. "What do you mean?" "Your gear, your clothes, the way you keep your bunk area. Most men your age live like pigs. But you fold everything just so. Keep your boots polished, wash more than most." Polish Eddie chuckled from his corner. "Maybe his Mama taught him good habits before she died." "Maybe," Colt said, but his tone suggested he wasn't buying it. "Or maybe he learned those habits somewhere else entirely." The conversation was interrupted by the bunkhouse door slamming open. Jake Sullivan stepped inside, shaking snow from his coat and stamping his boots. His face was grim. "Lost 12 head in the north pasture," he announced. "Found them this morning. Frozen solid. This storm's worse than we thought." Marcus sat up straighter. "Wolves? No sign of predators, just the cold and wind. But that's not our biggest problem." Jake's pale eyes swept the room. "Found tracks near the south boundary. Boot prints, horse hooves. Someone's been watching the ranch." A chill that had nothing to do with the weather settled over the room. In cattle country, strangers watching a ranch usually meant only one thing. "Rustlers?" Billy asked, his young voice tight with concern. "Most likely. Which means when this storm breaks, we're going to have our hands full. I want everyone armed and alert. No one rides alone, and everyone keeps their eyes open." As Jake turned to leave, his gaze settled on Sarah. "Sam, I want to see you outside for a minute." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she followed Jake out into the storm. The wind cut through her coat like it was made of paper, and she had to lean into it to keep from being blown over. Jake led her to the relative shelter of the barn's lee side before speaking. "How are you settling in?" "Fine, sir," Sarah replied, though her voice was nearly lost in the wind. "The men seem to like you well enough. Marcus speaks highly of your work." Jake paused, studying her face in the dim light. "But there's something about you that doesn't quite add up." Sarah's mouth went dry. "I don't understand." "Your hands, for one thing. You say you worked cattle in Kansas, but your hands don't show the kind of wear I'd expect from years of ranch work. And you're shooting. When's the last time you fired a rifle?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She'd been dreading this moment, knowing that eventually someone would expect her to demonstrate skills she simply didn't possess. "It's been a while," she said carefully. "How long is a while?" Sarah's mind raced. Any answer she gave could be checked, could lead to more questions she couldn't answer. "My uncle preferred I handle the animals rather than the guns." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes never leaving her face. "Tomorrow, when this storm breaks, I'm going to need every man who can shoot. Rustlers don't take prisoners, and they don't care how young or inexperienced you are. If you can't handle a weapon, you're a liability." "I can learn," Sarah said desperately. "You better hope so. Because if trouble comes and you can't pull your weight, people are going to die." Jake turned to go, then paused. "One more thing. Colt thinks there's something off about you. He's got good instincts about people, and he's never wrong. So whatever you're hiding, you better figure out how to deal with it before it gets you or someone else killed." That night, Sarah lay awake, listening to the wind howl around the bunkhouse and the quiet snores of her bunkmates. Jake's words echoed in her mind, along with the growing certainty that her deception was beginning to unravel. She'd managed to bluff her way through most of the ranch work by watching others and learning quickly. But firearms were different. There was no way to fake marksmanship, no way to pretend she knew how to load, aim, and fire a rifle when lives might depend on it. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow and ice. But there was no time to appreciate the beauty. Jake had everyone up before dawn, preparing for the possibility of trouble. "Shooting practice," Colt announced, setting up targets against the barn wall. "Everyone needs to be sharp." Sarah watched in growing dread as the other men took their turns. Marcus was a deadly shot, putting 3 rounds in a tight group at the center of his target. Polish Eddie was nearly as good, and even young Billy showed competent marksmanship. When her turn came, Sarah approached the firing line with hands that trembled despite the cold. The rifle felt heavy and foreign in her grip, and she had no idea how to properly sight the target. "You look like you never held a gun before," Colt observed, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Just nervous," Sarah muttered, trying to remember what she'd seen the others do. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, closed one eye, and pulled the trigger. The recoil knocked her backward, and the shot went so wide it didn't even hit the barn wall. A moment of stunned silence followed. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Polish Eddie breathed. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot?" Sarah's face burned with embarrassment and fear. Every eye was on her, and she could see the suspicion and doubt written plainly on their faces. "I'm out of practice," she said weakly. "Out of practice." Colt stepped forward, his gray eyes hard as flint. "Kid, you just shot like someone who's never held a rifle in his life. What kind of ranch work did you really do in Kansas?" Before Sarah could answer, Marcus stepped between them. "Maybe we should focus on getting him trained up instead of tearing him down," he said firmly. But the damage was done. Sarah could see it in their faces, the doubt, the questions, the growing certainty that Sam Parker wasn't who he claimed to be. Over the following days, the atmosphere in the bunkhouse grew increasingly tense. Conversations stopped when Sarah entered the room. Men who had been friendly before now watched her with suspicious eyes. Even Billy, who had looked up to her after the incident with Red Devil, seemed uncertain and confused. The breaking point came during the evening meal 3 days later. Colt had been drinking. Jake allowed the men 1 bottle of whiskey per week during winter months, and his tongue had loosened considerably. "You know what I think?" he said, his words slightly slurred, but his eyes sharp and focused on Sarah. "I think our boy Sam here is running from something. Maybe the law, maybe family trouble. But nobody comes to Montana with that kind of fear in their eyes, unless they're desperate." "Lots of men come west for a fresh start," Marcus said quietly. But there was less conviction in his voice than usual. "Sure they do. But they don't usually lie about their experience, and they sure as hell know how to shoot." Colt leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "What are you really running from, Sam Parker? What did you do back in Kansas that was so bad you had to disappear?" Sarah felt trapped, like a rabbit surrounded by wolves. Every face in the room was turned toward her, waiting for an answer that could satisfy their growing doubts. "I told you the truth," she said, but even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow. "Did you?" Colt's smile was sharp and predatory. "Because Tommy here thinks he's seen something interesting about the way you move, haven't you, Tommy?" The quiet horse handler looked uncomfortable being put on the spot, but he nodded slowly. "Something different," he said in his halting English. "Not like other men." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do," Colt said, standing up from the table. "In fact, I think that's enough." Jake's voice cut through the tension like a knife. He stood in the doorway, his pale eyes taking in the scene with obvious displeasure. "We've got real problems to worry about without creating new ones." "Jake, this kid's been lying to us from day one," Colt protested. "Maybe he has. But unless you've got proof of something that affects this ranch, I don't want to hear it." Jake's gaze swept the room. "We're short-handed as it is, and winter's just getting started. Whatever Sam's story is, he's been pulling his weight and earning his keep. That's all I care about right now." But as Sarah met Jake's eyes, She saw something there that chilled her to the bone. He suspected something too. The only difference was that Jake Sullivan was patient, willing to wait and watch until he had all the pieces of the puzzle. That night, as Sarah lay in her bunk listening to the wind rattling the windows, she knew her time was running out. The men were asking questions she couldn't answer, and sooner or later, someone would dig deep enough to uncover the truth. She thought about running, about slipping away in the night and trying to disappear into the vast Montana wilderness. But winter was coming in earnest now, and a person alone in this harsh land would die quickly. Besides, something had changed in her during these months at the Triple S Ranch. She'd found a strength she never knew she possessed, a sense of purpose and belonging that she'd never experienced as Sarah Whitmore. The idea of giving that up, of returning to a life of helplessness and dependence, filled her with a desperation that surprised her. She would find a way to make this work. She had to, because the alternative being discovered and cast out into a world that had no place for a woman like her was unthinkable. But as she finally drifted towards sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that forces beyond her control were already in motion, and that the careful life she'd built as Sam Parker was beginning to crumble like a house built on shifting sand. 4 months later, February 1900, the fever came without warning, striking Jake Sullivan down like a bolt of lightning on a clear day. One morning he was his usual commanding self, organizing the day's work and checking on the pregnant mares in the barn. By evening, he was delirious with fever, his skin burning hot to the touch, and his breathing shallow and labored. Doc Peterson rode out from town through a February snowstorm, his medical bag clutched against his chest as his horse struggled through knee-deep drifts. After examining Jake, he emerged from the ranch house with a grim expression that spoke volumes. "Pneumonia," he announced to the assembled ranch hands. "Bad case. Could go either way. He needs constant care, someone to keep the fever down, make sure he drinks fluids, watch for signs of improvement, or—" He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood. "I'll sit with him," Marcus volunteered immediately. "We'll take turns," Colt added, surprising everyone with the concern in his voice. But it was Sarah who stepped forward with quiet determination. "I'll take the night shifts. I don't sleep much anyway." Doc Peterson studied her with tired eyes. "You know anything about nursing?" Sarah thought of the long months she'd spent caring for her dying mother, the endless nights watching for changes in breathing, administering medicine, providing comfort in the face of inevitable loss. But Sam Parker couldn't have that experience. She said simply, "I can follow instructions." What followed were the longest 2 weeks of Sarah's time at the Triple S Ranch, while the other men maintained the daily operations, feeding cattle, breaking ice on water troughs, repairing storm damage. Sarah found herself virtually living in the main house, tending to Jake around the clock. The work was exhausting and heartbreaking. Jake's fever raged for days, leaving him weak and confused. Sometimes he didn't recognize her, calling her by names she didn't know, other ranch hands from years past, perhaps, or men he'd served with in the Army. Other times he was lucid enough to give her detailed instructions about ranch management, as if he knew his time might be running short. But it was during the quiet midnight hours, when Jake slept fitfully and Sarah sat beside his bed listening to his labored breathing, that something unexpected began to happen. The barriers she'd carefully constructed around her heart, the walls that protected Sam Parker's secret, began to crack. She found herself genuinely caring about this stern, fair man who had given her a chance when no one else would. She memorized the rhythm of his breathing, learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated whether his fever was rising or falling. When he woke confused and frightened in the small hours of the morning, she was there with cool water and gentle words. "Easy," she would whisper when he thrashed in the grip of fever dreams. "You're safe. Just rest." On the 8th night, Jake's fever finally broke. Sarah was dozing in the chair beside his bed when she heard him speak her name, Sam's name, in a clear, rational voice. "How long?" he asked, his pale blue eyes focusing on her face with effort. 8 days, Sarah replied, reaching for the water glass. "You had us worried." Jake tried to sit up, then thought better of it. "The ranch, Marcus and the others are handling everything. The cattle are fine, no losses from the cold snap." Sarah helped him drink, noting how his hands shook with weakness. "You need to focus on getting better." Over the following days, as Jake slowly regained his strength, something shifted in their relationship. The careful distance he'd maintained, the professional boundaries of boss and employee, began to blur. Perhaps it was gratitude, or perhaps it was simply the intimacy that comes from having someone care for you in your most vulnerable moments. "You could have gone back to the bunkhouse," Jake said one afternoon as Sarah brought him broth and fresh bread. "The others would have understood." "Someone needed to stay," Sarah replied, settling into the chair that had become her usual spot. "Besides, the bunkhouse is loud. You needed quiet." Jake studied her face with those penetrating pale eyes. "You're not what I expected when I hired you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Most men your age, they'd be chomping at the bit to get back to their regular work, back to the company of the other hands. But you've got, I don't know how to put it, a gentle touch. A way of knowing what someone needs without being told." The observation was dangerously close to the truth, and Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. "My uncle always said I was good with sick animals. Guess it carries over to people." "Maybe," Jake said, but there was something thoughtful in his expression. "Tell me about your family. Your parents, before you went to live with your uncle." This was the conversation Sarah had been dreading. The fictional backstory she'd created for Sam Parker was deliberately vague, designed to deflect rather than provide details. But now, faced with Jake's direct questions and obvious gratitude, she found herself wanting to share something real. "My mother died when I was young," she said, which was true enough. "My father, he wasn't around much after that. I'm sorry. That's a hard way to grow up." The sympathy in his voice was genuine, and Sarah felt tears threatening. When was the last time someone had shown her such kindness? When had anyone cared enough to ask about her pain? "What about you?" she asked, deflecting attention from herself. "You ever been married?" Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. Finally he spoke, his voice soft with memory. "Once. Her name was Catherine. She died 5 years ago. I'm sorry." "She would have liked you," Jake said. Suddenly, Catherine had a way of seeing the good in people, the potential they didn't even know they had. "She would have said you were worth investing in." The comment hit Sarah like a physical blow. Here was this good man, offering her praise and acceptance, and she was lying to him with every breath. The weight of her deception felt suddenly unbearable. That night, as Jake slept peacefully for the first time in 2 weeks, Sarah sat by the window looking out at the snow-covered ranch. She thought about the months since her arrival, about the way she'd slowly carved out a place for herself in this harsh but beautiful world. The other men had gradually accepted her again after the shooting incident. Marcus had taken it upon himself to teach her marksmanship, patiently working with her until she could at least hit a target more often than not. Polish Eddie had shown her how to repair tack and mend fences. Even Tommy Chun had begun including her in his quiet observations about the horses, sharing knowledge that couldn't be found in any book, but it was Jake's growing trust and respect that meant the most to her. He'd begun asking for her opinions on ranch matters, including her in decisions that affected the operation. He'd started calling her by her first name, Sam, in a way that suggested friendship rather than mere employment. "Sarah," the soft voice startled her from her reverie. Jake was awake, propped up on his elbow and looking at her with concern. "What?" Sarah's heart stopped. Had she heard him correctly? "I said Sam," You looked like you were 1,000 miles away." Sarah exhaled shakily, just thinking. About what? She turned from the window to face him. About how strange life is. How you can end up in places you never expected, becoming someone you never thought you could be. Jake nodded slowly. Montana has a way of changing people, usually for the better, if they let it. What if someone came here under false pretenses? Sarah asked, the words spilling out before she could stop them. What if they weren't who they claimed to be? Jake was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I suppose it would depend on why they felt the need to lie and what they did. With the chance they'd been given, even if the lie was big. Important? Everyone's running from something. Sam, the question is whether they're running towards something better or just running away. In my experience, it's the actions that matter, not the history. Sarah felt tears threatening again. And if someone wanted to tell the truth, but they were afraid? Afraid of losing everything they'd worked for. Jake sat up fully now, his pale eyes intense despite his weakness. Then I'd say that person needs to decide what's more important, living a lie or taking the risk that comes with honesty. Before Sarah could respond, the sound of horses approaching at a gallop shattered the quiet of the night. Both of them turned toward the window as shouts erupted from the direction of the bunkhouse. Boss, you better get out here." Jake was already struggling to get out of bed, though he was still weak from his illness. Sarah helped him to the window where they could see Marcus and Colt standing in the yard, their faces grim in the lamplight. "What is it?" Jake called out through the glass. "Rustlers hit the north pasture," Marcus shouted back. "Took maybe 30 head. Trail's fresh, they can't be more than a few hours ahead." Jake cursed under his breath and reached for his clothes. "Help me get dressed," he said to Sarah. "You're not strong enough." "Like hell I'm not. That's my cattle they took, and no one steals from the S without answering for it." As Sarah helped Jake into his clothes, she felt the peaceful intimacy of the past 2 weeks shattering like glass. The real world was intruding again, bringing with it violence and danger, and the kind of tests that could expose every weakness, every lie, every carefully constructed deception. Within an hour, the ranch was alive with activity as the men prepared for what could be a deadly pursuit. Guns were cleaned and loaded, horses were saddled, and supplies were packed for what might be a days-long chase across the frozen Montana landscape. And Sarah found herself facing a choice that could determine not only her own fate, but the fate of the man she'd come to care about more than she dared admit. She could stay behind, safe in the knowledge that her secret would remain protected. Or she could join the pursuit, knowing that in the heat of action, under the pressure of life and death situations, even the most carefully maintained disguise could crumble. As she strapped on the gun belt Marcus had given her, Sarah realized that the time for half measures and careful lies was over. Whatever happened in the days ahead would either prove her worthy of the trust these men had placed in her, or it would destroy everything she'd worked so hard to build. Either way, there was no turning back now. Dawn, February 15th, 1900, the trail was 3 hours old and heading north toward the Badlands when Jake's posse finally caught up with the rustlers. Sarah rode beside Marcus at the back of the group, her rifle clutched in hands that had grown steadier over the months of practice, but her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the hard ride. Ahead of them, Jake sat his horse like a man carved from stone, studying the terrain through field glasses despite the weakness that still lingered from his illness. His jaw was set in the hard line Sarah had learned to recognize as his fighting face. 6 men, he said quietly, lowering the glasses. They've got our cattle in Devil's Canyon. Only one way in, one way out. Colt spat into the frozen ground. Could be a trap. They might have posted lookouts. Probably, Jake agreed. But those are S cattle, and I'll be damned if I let them disappear into the territories. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February air. She'd heard stories about rustlers, men who lived outside the law, who would kill without hesitation to protect their stolen goods. The thought of riding into a potential ambush made her stomach clench with fear, but it was Tommy Chun who voiced what everyone was thinking. Maybe we should wait for sheriff. Send someone to town. Jake shook his head grimly. By the time the sheriff could get here, they'd be long gone with our stock. We handle this ourselves. He turned in his saddle to face the 5 men who had volunteered to ride with him. I won't lie to you, this could get ugly. Anyone who wants to turn back, now's the time. No shame in it. Sarah felt every eye turn toward her. She was the youngest, the least experienced, the one with the most to prove. The sensible thing would be to volunteer to ride back to the ranch, to carry word to the authorities, to stay safe while the real men handled the dangerous work. But as she looked at Jake's pale, determined face, she knew she couldn't abandon him. Not after the weeks of quiet conversations, not after seeing him vulnerable and trusting her to care for him, not after he'd offered her acceptance and a chance at belonging. I'm staying, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Marcus nodded approvingly. Good man. They left their horses half a mile from the canyon mouth, approaching on foot through the scattered boulders that littered the approach. Sarah's borrowed boots slipped on the icy rocks, and more than once Marcus had to steady her with a firm hand on her arm. The sound of cattle reached them first, the low bellowing of animals that had been driven hard and were now milling nervously in the confined space of the canyon. Then came voices, rough and careless with the confidence of men who thought they were safely beyond pursuit. Jake held up his hand, bringing the group to a halt behind a massive boulder. He gestured for them to gather close, then spoke in a whisper barely audible above the wind. Colt, you and Eddie circle around to the north rim. Marcus, you and Tommy take the south. Give us 15 minutes to get into position, then start shooting. Aim for the horses first. We want them pinned down, not running. What about me? Sarah whispered. Jake's pale eyes studied her face for a long moment. You stay with me. We're going in the front door. It was both an honor and a terrifying responsibility. Jake was trusting her to watch his back in what could be a deadly confrontation. As the other men melted away into the rocks like ghosts, Sarah checked her rifle one more time and tried to steady her breathing. The next 15 minutes crawled by like hours. Sarah crouched beside Jake behind a wind-carved outcropping, watching the canyon mouth and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. Her palms were sweating despite the cold, and she had to keep wiping them on her coat to maintain her grip on the rifle. Scared? Jake asked quietly. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Good. Fear keeps you alive as long as you don't let it paralyze you. Jake checked his pistol, then looked at her seriously. When the shooting starts, stay low and watch your targets. These men won't hesitate to kill you. The first shot cracked across the canyon like thunder, followed immediately by shouts of alarm and the sound of horses whinnying in panic. Jake was moving before the echo faded, and Sarah forced herself to follow him into the narrow canyon entrance. What she saw inside made her stomach lurch. 6 hard-faced men scrambled for cover among the stolen cattle, their weapons already drawn. One of them, a bearded giant with a scar across his forehead, spotted Jake immediately and raised his rifle. It's Sullivan, he shouted. Kill them. All! The canyon erupted in gunfire. Sarah threw herself behind a fallen log, just as bullets began chipping bark inches from her head. The sound was deafening, echoing off the canyon walls until it seemed like an army was shooting at them. She forced herself to raise her rifle and look for targets, but everything was chaos and smoke and terrified cattle. One of the rustlers was using the animals as cover, working his way toward Jake's position with deadly intent. Without thinking, Sarah aimed and pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, but it was close enough to make the man dive for better cover. She worked the bolt action and fired again, this time coming closer to her target. "Good shooting," Jake called out, though she could barely hear him over the din. Battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Gradually, the superior positioning of Jake's men began to tell. Caught in a crossfire with no escape route, the rustlers found themselves pinned down and outgunned. "Throw down." "Your weapons," Jake shouted during a lull in the firing. "You're surrounded." The response was a renewed volley of shots, but Sarah could hear the desperation in it now. These men knew they were trapped. It was Polish Eddie who ended the standoff. Moving along the north rim with the skill of an old soldier, he managed to get behind the rustlers' main position. His rifle cracked once, twice, and suddenly the return fire slackened dramatically. "That's Hawkins down," Colt called out. "The big one with the scar." Without their leader, the remaining rustlers quickly lost their will to fight. One by one, they threw down their weapons and emerged from cover with their hands raised. Sarah felt weak with relief as the shooting finally stopped. Her ears were ringing, and her hands shook as she lowered her rifle. She'd actually done it. She'd fought alongside the men and held her own in a real gunfight, but the victory was short-lived. "We got wounded here," Marcus called out from across the canyon. Jake was already moving, and Sarah followed him to where Tommy Chun lay behind a boulder, his face pale and his shirt dark with blood. A bullet had caught him in the shoulder, and he was losing blood fast. "How bad?" Jake asked, kneeling beside the injured man. Marcus was already applying pressure to the wound. "Bad enough. Bullet's still in there, and he's bleeding heavy. We need to get him to Doc Peterson." Sarah found herself kneeling on Tommy's other side, her hands moving automatically to help Marcus apply pressure to the wound. The sight of so much blood should have made her sick, but instead she felt the same calm focus that had sustained her through Jake's illness. "Easy, Tommy," she murmured, just as she had to Jake during his fever dreams. "We're going to get you home." Tommy's dark eyes focused on her face with effort. His lips moved, and she leaned closer to hear what he was trying to say. "I know," he whispered, so quietly that only she could hear. Sarah's blood went cold. "What?" "But..." Tommy's eyes had already closed, and Marcus was calling for help to carry him back to the horses. The ride back to the ranch was a nightmare of anxiety and pain. Tommy drifted in and out of consciousness, and twice they had to stop to re-bandage his wound. Sarah rode beside the makeshift stretcher they'd rigged between two horses, her mind racing with implications of those two whispered words. What did Tommy know? How long had he suspected? And who else might he have told? They reached the ranch just as Doc Peterson's buggy was pulling into the yard. Marcus had sent Billy ahead to fetch him. The next few hours were a blur of activity as the doctor worked to remove the bullet and stabilize Tommy's condition. Jake gathered the remaining men around the kitchen table to discuss what had happened. 3 of the rustlers were dead. 2 were wounded and would be transported to the territorial prison, and 1 had managed to escape in the confusion. All of the stolen cattle had been recovered. "You all did good work today," Jake said, his pale eyes moving around the table. "Especially you, Sam. For someone who claimed he was out of practice with firearms, you held your own pretty well." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks under the praise, but it was mixed with the cold fear of Tommy's whispered words. "Just did what needed doing. That bullet you put past Hawkins's ear probably saved my life," Jake continued. "He had me dead to rights before you made him take cover." As the men dispersed to tend to evening chores, Jake caught Sarah's arm. "Walk with me," he said quietly. They strolled out toward the corral in the gathering dusk, the snow crunching under their boots. For a while, neither spoke, both lost in their own thoughts about the day's events. "You've changed since you came here," Jake said finally. "When I first hired you, you were just a scared kid running from something. Today, you fought like a man." Protecting his home, Sarah's throat tightened. "This is my home now, is it?" Jake stopped walking and turned to face her. "Because there's still something you're not telling me. Something that makes you look over your shoulder like you're expecting trouble." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths and gathering shadows. Sarah could feel the weight of her secret pressing down on her like a physical burden. Part of her wanted to tell him everything about Sarah Whitmore, about the desperate flight from her old life, about the fear and loneliness that had driven her to this deception. But before she could speak, Doc Peterson emerged from the main house, his medical bag in hand and a grim expression on his weathered face. "How is he?" Jake asked immediately. "He'll live, but it was close. Lost a lot of blood." The doctor paused, studying Sarah with curious eyes. Interesting thing, though. While he was delirious from blood loss, he kept mumbling something in Chinese. Then he switched to English and said the strangest thing. Sarah's heart stopped. "What did he say?" Doc Peterson scratched his gray beard thoughtfully. He kept saying, "She saved me," over and over. "She saved me." Strange thing for a man to say when all the help he got came from other men. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could feel Jake's eyes boring into her, could sense the questions forming in his mind. The careful life she'd built as Sam Parker was crumbling around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Well," Doc Peterson said finally, climbing into his buggy, "men say strange things when they're hurt bad. Wouldn't read too much into it." But as the doctor's buggy disappeared into the gathering darkness, Sarah knew that her time was running out. The secret she'd guarded so carefully was beginning to surface, and soon she would have to make a choice that would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of the relationship she'd worked so hard to build. In the distance, a coyote howled, and the sound seemed to echo the loneliness that was settling back into her heart like an old, familiar pain. 3 months later, May 1900, spring came to Montana like a promise kept. The snow melted from the valleys first, then retreated up the mountainsides until only the highest peaks wore caps of white. Wildflowers exploded across the meadows in riots of color, and the cattle grew fat on new grass. For the first time since arriving at the Triple S Ranch, Sarah felt something approaching peace. Tommy Chun had recovered fully from his gunshot wound, though he still favored his left shoulder on cold mornings. More importantly, his delirious words from that terrible night seemed to have been forgotten by everyone except Sarah herself. He treated her exactly as he always had, with quiet respect and the occasional shy smile, when she helped him with the horses, but Sarah knew better than to relax completely. She'd caught Tommy watching her sometimes with those intelligent dark eyes, and she sensed he was waiting for something. Whether it was waiting for her to confess or waiting for the right moment to expose her, she couldn't tell. The physical changes in her body were becoming harder to hide. 3 years of hard ranch work had transformed her from the soft, pampered young lady she'd once been into someone lean and strong. But lately, she'd been dealing with new challenges, subtle changes that terrified her even as she tried to convince herself they meant nothing. The morning sickness had started 6 weeks ago. At first, she'd attributed it to something she'd eaten, or perhaps the stress of maintaining her deception for so long. But as the weeks passed and the pattern became undeniable, Sarah was forced to confront a truth that threatened to destroy everything she built. She was pregnant. The realization hit her like a physical blow as she stood in the barn that warm May morning, fighting down another wave of nausea while pretending to check the grain supplies. How could this have happened? She'd been so careful, so vigilant about maintaining her masculine disguise, but even as she asked the question, she knew the answer. It had been during the blizzard in January, when she'd taken shelter in an abandoned line shack with Jake during a 3-day storm. The cold had been brutal, life-threatening, and they'd huddled together for warmth under shared blankets. What had started as survival had turned into something else entirely, a moment of connection and intimacy that had seemed as natural as breathing. She'd told herself afterward that it was just the circumstances, The adrenaline and fear making them both act irrationally. Jake had never mentioned it, never treated her differently, and she'd convinced herself it had been a mistake that wouldn't be repeated. Now, standing in the barn with her hand pressed to her still flat stomach, Sarah realized that one moment of weakness had doomed everything she'd worked for. There was no way to hide a pregnancy indefinitely, no way to explain how Sam Parker could give birth to a child. "You feeling all right?" Sarah spun around to find Marcus standing in the doorway, his broad face creased with concern. "You've been looking peaked lately." "Just tired," Sarah said quickly. "Haven't been sleeping well." Marcus studied her with those kind brown eyes that missed very little. "Maybe you should see Doc Peterson. Could be you picked up something in town." "I'm fine," Sarah insisted, but even to her own ears, her voice sounded strained. Before Marcus could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the yard. A group of riders was coming up the main road, too many to be casual visitors, too organized to be drifters. Sarah counted at least 8 men, all armed, all sitting their horses with the easy confidence of men accustomed to violence. Jake emerged from the main house as the riders entered the yard. Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his right hand rested casually near his gun belt. The lead rider was a tall man with steel gray hair and a badge pinned to his vest, a territorial marshal by the look of him. "Sullivan," the marshal said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more courtesy than respect. "I'm Marshal Wade Harrison. We need to talk." "What about?" Jake's voice was carefully neutral. "About the rustlers you killed 3 months ago. Specifically, about whether you had the right to gun them down without a trial." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. She'd known this day might come. Rustlers had friends and family, people who might demand justice or revenge. But she'd hoped the territorial authorities would see it as a simple case of protecting property and defending themselves. "They shot first," Jake said firmly. "We recovered stolen cattle and defended ourselves against armed thieves." "So you say. But I've got witnesses who tell a different story. They claim you executed wounded men who were trying to surrender." "That's a lie." Jake's voice was hard as granite now. "Anyone who says different wasn't there." Marshal Harrison's pale eyes swept the assembled ranch hands who had gathered at the sound of voices. "I'll need to question everyone who was part of that posse. Starting with your newest hand, Sam Parker, isn't it?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as the marshal's gaze settled on her. This was exactly what she'd feared: official attention. Questions that might lead to deeper investigations into her background and identity. "Sam's a good man," Jake said firmly. "Saved my life during that fight. I'm sure he did. But I still need to hear his version of events." The marshal dismounted and walked towards Sarah with the measured pace of a man accustomed to intimidating suspects. "You are Sam Parker?" "Yes, sir," Sarah managed to say. "You were part of the posse that tracked down the rustlers?" "Yes, sir." "And you witnessed the shootout in Devil's Canyon?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. The marshal was studying her face with the intensity of a man trained to spot lies and deception. She could feel sweat beading on her forehead, despite the cool morning air. "Funny thing," Marshal Harrison said conversationally. "I've been asking around about you, Sam Parker. Seems like you appeared out of nowhere about a year ago, with no one able to verify your story about working cattle in Kansas." The world seemed to tilt around Sarah. "I told the truth about my experience." "Did you?" "Because I sent a telegram to the county sheriff in the area you claim to be from. No record of any Sam Parker working cattle there. No record of any family by that name owning a ranch." Sarah felt trapped, like a rabbit in a snare. Around her, she could see the faces of the men she'd worked beside for months: Marcus's confusion, Colt's growing suspicion, Jake's pale eyes burning with questions she couldn't answer. "Maybe they got the wrong county," she said desperately. "Maybe, or maybe Sam Parker isn't your real name." The marshal stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. I've seen a lot of people running from the law. Son, they all have that same look in their eyes, like they're waiting for the past to catch up with them. What are you really running from?" Before Sarah could answer, a commotion erupted near the barn. Tommy Chun had been trying to calm a spooked horse when the animal suddenly reared, striking out with iron-shod hooves. The young man went down hard, and Sarah could see blood spreading across his forehead. Without thinking, she broke away from the marshal and ran toward the injured man. Her reaction was pure instinct, the same nurturing impulse that had driven her to care for Jake during his illness. She dropped to her knees beside Tommy, her hands moving with practiced efficiency to assess his injuries. "Easy," she murmured, cradling his head gently. "Don't try to move." Tommy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. Blood was trickling from a gash above his left eyebrow, and Sarah could see he was dazed from the blow. "Someone get Doc Peterson," she called out, then turned her attention back to Tommy. "It's going to be all right. Just stay still." As she worked to stop the bleeding and keep Tommy conscious, Sarah was dimly aware of the men gathering around them, but all her focus was on the injured man in her arms, on the familiar rhythm of providing care and comfort to someone in need. It wasn't until Tommy's eyes cleared and focused on her face that she realized what she'd done. In her concern for his welfare, she'd forgotten to maintain the careful masculine facade she'd worked so hard to construct. Her voice had been soft, gentle, unmistakably feminine. Her touch had been tender in a way that went beyond mere friendship or duty, and Tommy saw it all. Their eyes met and held for a long moment. Then, so quietly that only she could hear, he whispered two words that shattered her world. "I understand." "Understand what?" Marshal Harrison's voice cut through the moment like a blade. He was standing directly over them, his pale eyes taking in every detail of the scene. Sarah felt panic rising in her throat. The marshal had heard Tommy's words, had seen her instinctive reaction to his injury. How much more evidence would he need before he started asking the questions that would destroy everything? "He's delirious," she said quickly, helping Tommy sit up. Head injuries can cause confusion. But the marshal's eyes were sharp and suspicious as he studied both of them. "Seems to me like there's a lot of confusion going around here. Maybe it's time we got some answers." Jake stepped forward, his face hard with determination. "Marshal, if you've got charges to bring against any of my men, then bring them. Otherwise, I'd appreciate it if you'd stop harassing people who were just doing their jobs." "Oh, I'll bring charges all right," Harrison said with a cold smile. "But they might not be the charges you're expecting. There's something about your boy Sam that doesn't add up, and I intend to find out what it is." As the marshal turned away to confer with his men, Sarah found herself caught between Jake's worried gaze and Tommy's knowing eyes. The secret she'd guarded so carefully was unraveling like a rope under too much strain, and she could feel the weight of discovery pressing down on her like a physical burden. She had perhaps hours before the marshal's investigation exposed her identity. Hours before the men she'd worked beside and come to care about learned that Sam Parker was a lie, that they'd been deceived by someone they'd trusted with their lives. But even worse than the fear of exposure was the knowledge that Jake would learn the truth about their night in the line shack. He would realize that the person he'd held close during that long, cold night hadn't been Sam Parker at all, but Sarah Whitmore, a woman who had deceived him in the most intimate way possible. As she helped Tommy to his feet and watched the marshal's suspicious eyes follow her every movement, Sarah realized that the moment of choice she'd been dreading for months had finally arrived. She could run, disappearing into the vast Montana wilderness and leaving behind everything she'd built at the Triple S Ranch, or she could stay and face the consequences of her deception, knowing that the truth would probably destroy not only her new life, but the trust and respect of the only people who had ever accepted her for who she appeared to be. The sun climbed higher in the spring sky, and Sarah felt time running out like sand through her fingers. Soon, very soon, she would have to decide whether Sarah Whitmore was worth fighting for, or whether Sam Parker's lie was all she had left to hold on to. Late afternoon. Same day, May 1900, the interrogations had been going on for 3 hours. Marshal Harrison had set up his makeshift courthouse in the ranch house dining room, questioning each member of the posse individually about the events in Devil's Canyon. Sarah sat in the kitchen, waiting her turn, watching through the doorway. As one by one, her friends and colleagues faced the marshal's sharp questions, Marcus had emerged first, his broad face grim but confident. "Told him exactly what happened," he'd said quietly to Sarah. "Truth's on our side." Polish Eddie came out shaking his head in disgust. "That man, he thinks we are criminals. Wants to know if Jake gave orders to kill wounded men. Ridiculous." But it was Colt who delivered the news that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Marshall's asking specific questions about you," he said, his gray eyes fixed on her face with uncomfortable intensity. "Wants to know how you handled yourself in the fight. Whether you seemed to know what you were doing with that rifle. Asked if I thought you were really who you claimed to be." Sarah's throat went dry. "What did you tell him?" "Told him you fought like a man defending his home," Colt replied. "But I also told him I'd had my doubts about you from day one." That seemed to interest him considerable. Before Sarah could respond, Jake himself appeared in the kitchen doorway. His face was pale and drawn, and she could see the strain of the day's events written in the tight lines around his eyes. "Your turn," he said simply as Sarah followed Jake. Toward the dining room, he caught her arm gently. "Whatever this is about, whatever you're hiding, you need to tell the truth. Harrison's got a reputation for getting answers one way or another." The dining room felt smaller with Marshal Harrison's imposing presence filling it. He sat behind the oak table like a judge at trial, his steel-gray hair catching the light from the window, his pale eyes studying Sarah with the intensity of a hawk watching a mouse. "Sit down, Mr. Parker," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Let's have ourselves a conversation." Sarah sat carefully, trying to project the calm confidence of an innocent man with nothing to hide. But her hands were trembling slightly, and she had to clasp them together in her lap to keep the shaking from showing. "Tell me about the fight in Devil's Canyon," Harrison began. "Your version of events." Sarah recounted the battle as accurately as she could, sticking to the facts and avoiding any details that might reveal her inexperience or fear. The marshal listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound book. "You handled yourself well for someone so young," he observed when she finished. "Your first gunfight?" The question was casual, but Sarah sensed a trap. "No, sir. I'd had occasion to use firearms before." "In Kansas, you mean? Protecting your uncle's cattle?" "Yes, sir." Marshal Harrison flipped through several pages of his notebook. "Funny thing about that uncle of yours. I sent telegrams to every county in Kansas, asking about Sam Parker and his family. No one's heard of them." Sarah felt sweat beading on her forehead. "Maybe they didn't remember. I also checked birth records, property deeds, even church registrations." The marshal's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "Sam Parker doesn't exist in Kansas, never has." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the careful life she'd built crumbling around her like a house of cards in a strong wind. "So," Harrison continued, "I find myself wondering who you really are, and what you're running from. That's so bad you had to steal a dead man's name." "I don't know what you mean," Sarah said weakly. "Don't you? Because here's what I think happened. I think Sam Parker was a real person who died somewhere between Kansas and Montana. Maybe on the trail, maybe from sickness, maybe from violence. And I think you took his papers and his identity because you needed to disappear." Sarah's mouth had gone completely dry. "That's not. The question is," Harrison interrupted, "what did you do that was so terrible you had to become someone else?" "Entirely? Murder? Theft? Desertion from the army? Before Sarah could answer, a commotion erupted outside. Through the window, she could see one of the marshal's men riding hard toward the house, his horse lathered with sweat and foam. He pulled up in a cloud of dust and dismounted quickly. Harrison excused himself and stepped onto the porch to speak with his deputy. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she could see the urgency in their gestures, the way the marshal's expression grew increasingly grim. When Harrison returned to the dining room, his entire demeanor had changed. The casual interrogation was over. Now he looked like a man who had just confirmed his worst suspicions. "Well, Mr. Parker, or whoever you are, it seems we've had a breakthrough." He sat down heavily and fixed her with those pale, unforgiving eyes. "My deputy just returned from town with some very interesting information." Sarah's heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Seems the territorial governor received a telegram 3 days ago from the sheriff of Millfield County. Back east, they're looking for a missing person, a young woman who disappeared after her family's farm was foreclosed. Woman named Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. After all these months of being Sam Parker, hearing her real name spoken aloud felt like being stripped naked in front of strangers. According to the description, Harrison continued relentlessly, Miss Whitmore was about 17 years old. Medium height, auburn hair, and ... double quotes. He paused dramatically. Known to be with child by a man who abandoned her after promising marriage. Sarah felt the world spinning around her. The story was wrong. She hadn't been pregnant when she fled her old life. But the rest was close enough to the truth to be devastating. "Now I'm wondering," Harrison said, his voice soft and dangerous, "what are the odds that a missing pregnant woman from back east and a mysterious young man who appeared in Montana at about the same time are completely unrelated?" "You're mistaken," Sarah began desperately. "Am I? Because here's what I think happened. I think Sarah Whitmore ran away from her problems, disguised herself as a man, and has been living a lie for the past year. I think Sam Parker is nothing but a costume, and underneath it all, you're still just a scared girl who got herself in trouble." The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Sarah felt tears threatening, felt the carefully constructed walls around Sam Parker's identity finally crumbling beyond repair. "And if I'm right," Harrison continued, "that makes you guilty of fraud, identity theft, and probably half a dozen other crimes. But more importantly, it makes you a liar who's been deceiving good people who trusted you." Before Sarah could respond, the dining room door opened and Jake stepped inside. His face was pale, and Sarah could see from his expression that he'd heard at least part of the conversation. "Is it true?" Jake asked quietly, his pale blue eyes searching her face. "Are you really Sarah Whitmore?" The moment stretched between them like a taut rope. Sarah looked into the eyes of the man she'd come to love, the man whose child she was carrying, and saw her reflection fracturing into 1,000 pieces. "Jake," she began. "Answer the question," he said, his voice rough with hurt and confusion. "Are you a woman?" The simple question destroyed the last of her defenses. After months of careful lies and practiced deception, Sarah found she couldn't speak the words that would maintain Sam Parker's existence. Instead, she simply nodded. The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, hurt, and finally something that might have been betrayal. "How long have you known?" Marshal Harrison asked Jake. "I didn't," Jake said quietly, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "I suspected something was ... different, but I never imagined ... He trailed off, shaking his head. "Well, this certainly changes things," Harrison said with satisfaction. "Miss Whitmore, you're under arrest for fraud and identity theft. You'll be transported back east to face charges." "No," the word came out, stronger than Sarah had intended. She stood up slowly, feeling something shift inside her, a core of strength she'd discovered during her time as Sam Parker. I won't go back. You don't have a choice in the matter. Don't I? Sarah turned to face Jake fully, her chin raised despite the tears threatening to spill over. Jake, I know you have every right to hate me for lying to you. But I need you to understand Sam Parker wasn't just a disguise. He was who I became when I found the strength to survive on my own. Jake's expression was unreadable. And Sarah Whitmore was a frightened girl who had nothing and no one, who would have died if she hadn't found the courage to become someone else by lying to everyone who tried to help you. The accusation stung because it was true. By doing whatever it took to survive. Just like you would have done. Just like any of you would have done if you'd been desperate enough. Marshal Harrison stood up impatiently. This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the facts. You committed crimes, and you'll answer for them. What crimes? Sarah demanded, turning to face him. Working hard? Earning my keep? Fighting. To protect this ranch and the people on it? Fraud, for starters. Identity theft. Probably dozens of other. I never stole anything, Sarah interrupted. I never hurt anyone. I worked harder than most of the men you'll ever meet, and I earned every dollar I was paid. By lying about who you were. By being who I needed to be. Sarah felt a strength flowing through her that she'd never known she possessed. And if that's a crime, then half the men in Montana Territory are criminals. How many of them came west with false names, running from something they'd rather forget? The marshal's eyes narrowed. That's different, is it? Or is it only different because I'm a woman? Before Harrison could answer, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention to the window. A large group of riders was coming up the road, not lawmen this time, but ranch hands from neighboring spreads, along with several men Sarah recognized from town. Jake moved to the window, his expression puzzled. That's Tom Henderson and his crew. Bill MacReady from the Circle C. What are they all doing here? The answer came when Marcus appeared in the doorway, his broad face grim but determined. Jake, you need to hear this. Word's gotten around about what's happening here, and folks ain't happy about it. What do you mean? Jake asked. They're saying the marshal's trying to arrest Sam for being a woman. And they're saying that's about the stupidest thing they ever heard. Marshal Harrison pushed past them onto the porch, where he found himself facing nearly 30 armed men on horseback. The lead rider, a grizzled rancher named Tom Henderson, touched his hat brim in a gesture that held more challenge than respect. Marshal, Henderson said conversationally. Heard you got some trouble here. No trouble, Harrison replied carefully. Just doing my job. Your job, huh? Another voice spoke up from the back of the group. And what job is that, exactly? Arresting folks for working hard and earning their keep? Sarah stepped onto the porch behind the marshal, acutely aware that every eye was now fixed on her. These men had known her as Sam Parker, had worked alongside her, respected her abilities. Now they were looking at her with curiosity, confusion, but also something that surprised her protectiveness. Sam, or whatever your name is, Henderson called out. You want to tell us what's really going on here? Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This was it, the final moment of truth, with no more room for deception or half-truths. My name is Sarah Whitmore, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air. I came to Montana Territory disguised as a man because I had nowhere else to go and no other way to survive. I've worked alongside most of you, and I've tried to earn my place here honestly. A murmur ran through the crowd of riders, but no one spoke. The marshal says I'm a criminal for pretending to be someone I'm not. Maybe he's right, legally speaking. But I've never stolen anything except the chance to work and prove myself. And if that makes me a criminal, then I guess I'll have to live with that. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice, Tommy Chun, who had emerged from the barn with a bandage wrapped around his head. She saved my life, he said in his careful English. Today, and 3 months ago when rustlers shot. Me, Sam Parker, or Sarah Whitmore doesn't matter. Good person, brave person. That matters. Boy's got a point, Henderson said thoughtfully. Far as I can see, this young lady's been doing a man's work and doing it well. Don't see how that's anybody's business but her own. Marshal Harrison's face was flushed with anger and frustration. The law is the law, regardless of popular opinion. Maybe, Henderson replied with a thin smile. But popular opinion tends to carry a lot of weight in Montana territory. And right now, popular opinion says you're making a mountain out of a molehill. As the standoff continued, Sarah found herself caught between hope and despair. The support of these hard, practical men meant more to her than she could have imagined. But she knew that legal authority trumped popular sentiment, and Marshal Harrison had the power to destroy everything she'd built. The question was whether Jake Sullivan, the man whose opinion mattered most to her, would stand with her or against her when the final choice had to be made. Evening. Same day, May 1900. The standoff on the porch of the Triple S Ranch had stretched into the golden hour of late afternoon, with neither Marshal Harrison nor the assembled ranchers willing to back down. Sarah stood between them, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her, knowing that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just her fate, but the kind of person she would be for the rest of her life. It was Jake who finally broke the tense silence. "Marshal," he said, stepping forward with the quiet authority that had made him a respected leader in the territory. "I'd like a word with you, in private." Harrison's pale eyes flicked between Jake and the armed men still sitting their horses in the yard. "I don't think. It wasn't a request," Jake said firmly. 5 minutes. Just you and me." The two men walked toward the barn, leaving Sarah alone on the porch with the weight of 30 pairs of eyes upon her. She could hear low murmurs from the assembled riders, catch fragments of conversation that suggested these hard, practical men were taking her measure all over again. Seeing Sam Parker's familiar form through the lens of Sarah Whitmore's revealed identity. Marcus climbed down from his horse and approached the porch. "Don't matter what name you go by," he said quietly, his deep voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "You pulled your weight, fought when fighting was needed, and helped when help was called for. That's what counts out here." Polish Eddie nodded agreement. "In the old country, we have saying, 'Judge tree by fruit it bears, not by seed it came.' From, you bear good fruit, Samsara, whatever name you choose." But it was Tommy Chun who surprised her most. The quiet horse handler stepped forward, his head still bandaged from the morning's accident, and spoke in his careful English. "In China, we believe person can be reborn, become new self through hard work and honorable actions. You did this. Sam Parker may be not real in papers, but real in heart, real in courage. Sarah Whitmore gave birth to Sam Parker, and Sam Parker saved us all." Tears threatened to spill down Sarah's cheeks as she looked at these men, rough, weathered, hardened by years of brutal work and harsh conditions, offering her acceptance and respect that she'd never received as a proper young lady in her former life. From the barn came the low rumble of heated conversation. Jake's voice rose once, sharp with anger, then dropped again to an inaudible murmur. Whatever he was saying to the marshal, it was clearly intense. Billy Garrett, the youngest of the ranch hands, spoke up from his position near the corral. "I got a question, if you don't mind me asking." His freckled face was serious, thoughtful. "All this time, when you were teaching me about handling cattle, about reading the weather signs, were you pretending to know those things, or did you really learn them?" Sarah met his earnest gaze directly. "Everything I taught you, I learned by watching you and the others, by making mistakes and paying attention to the consequences. Sam Parker didn't know anything about ranch work when he arrived here. But I was determined to learn." "Then you weren't lying about the important stuff," Billy said with a shy smile. "You were just becoming who you needed to be." The conversation was interrupted by Jake and Marshall Harrison emerging from the barn. Both men looked grim, and Sarah couldn't read the outcome of their private discussion from their expressions. Harrison approached the porch with reluctant steps. "Miss Whitmore," he said formally, "Mr. Sullivan has made certain representations regarding your character and value to this community." Jake stepped up beside the marshal, his pale blue eyes unreadable as they met Sarah's gaze. "I've told the marshal that the Triple S Ranch will vouch for your character and your contributions to this territory. I've also pointed out that prosecuting someone for the crime of working hard and living honestly might not be the best use of territorial resources. Furthermore," Harrison continued with obvious reluctance, "it appears that the original complaint about Sarah Whitmore has been withdrawn. The sheriff who sent the telegram received word that the missing person in question has been located. Apparently she married and moved to California, and simply forgot to inform her relatives." Sarah felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly buckled her knees. The fictional pregnant girl that the marshal had described wasn't her after all. It had been someone else entirely. Another Sarah whose disappearance had nothing to do with her own flight from her former life. "However," Harrison added sharply, "that doesn't resolve the question of identity fraud and false representation." Tom Henderson urged his horse forward. "Marshal, with all due respect, I think you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Far as I can see, this young lady worked for fair wages under whatever name she chose to use. Jake paid her as Sam Parker. She earned every dollar as Sam Parker. And Sam Parker never stole a thing from anybody. The law requires accurate identification." "The law requires a lot of things," Henderson interrupted. "But out here, we tend to judge folks by their actions rather than their paperwork. And this lady's actions speak pretty well for themselves." A chorus of agreement rose from the assembled riders. These men had seen Sarah work, had watched her prove herself in situations where weakness or incompetence could mean death. The revelation of her gender hadn't changed those facts. But it was Jake's next words that truly surprised her. "There is one matter that still needs to be resolved," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "And that's the question of Sarah's future here at the Triple S Ranch." Sarah's heart stopped. This was it, the moment when Jake would tell her to leave, to disappear back into the wilderness from which she'd emerged. She'd prepared herself for this possibility, but it still felt like a knife in her chest. Instead, Jake turned to face her directly, his pale eyes intense but not unkind. "Sarah Whitmore," he said formally, "I'm offering you a permanent position as foreman of the Triple S Ranch, if you're willing to take it." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Foreman, a position of authority and respect, second only to Jake himself in the ranch hierarchy. It was more than she'd ever dared hope for, even in her wildest dreams. "But," she stammered, "you're the most capable ranch hand I've ever worked with," Jake said firmly. "You've got natural instincts with cattle, you learn fast, and you've proven you can lead men in dangerous situations. The fact that you happen to be a woman doesn't change any of that." Marshall Harrison looked incredulous. "You're seriously offering a supervisory position to someone who's been lying about their identity for over a year?" "I'm offering a position to someone who's earned it," Jake replied. "Someone who's proven their worth through actions rather than words." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked around at the assembled men. Not one of them appeared shocked or outraged by Jake's offer. Instead, she saw nods of approval, smiles of encouragement, and the kind of respect that couldn't be faked or bought. "I accept," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. "But I have something else to tell you. Something that changes everything." Jake's expression became wary. "What?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that this final revelation would either cement her place at the Triple S Ranch or destroy it entirely. "I'm pregnant," she said simply, "and the child is yours." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to stop moving, as if the entire world was holding its breath waiting for Jake's response. Jake's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and then something that might have been wonder. From the line. "Shack," he said quietly, "during the blizzard." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. "Well," Tom Henderson said finally, breaking the stunned silence, "that does complicate things some." Marshal Harrison threw up his hands in disgust. "This just gets better and better. Now we've got unmarried pregnancy to add to the list of moral irregularities." But Jake wasn't listening to the marshal. He stepped closer to Sarah, his pale eyes searching her face as if seeing her for the first time. "Are you sure?" he asked gently. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "I've been sure for weeks. I was trying to figure out how to tell you when all this happened." Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then, to Sarah's amazement, he smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him all day. "Well," he said, "I guess that settles the question of whether you're staying, does it?" Instead of answering with words, Jake dropped to one knee right there on the porch, in front of God and 30 witnesses. From his pocket, he produced a simple gold band, his mother's ring. Sarah realized with shock. "Sarah Whitmore," he said clearly, "will you marry me?" The proposal hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. She dreamed of this moment, but never believed it. Could actually happen, not with her deception exposed, not with her pregnancy revealed, not with the truth of her identity laid bare for everyone to see. "Jake," she breathed, "you don't have to." "I'm not asking because I have to," he interrupted. "I'm asking because I want to. Because over the past year, I've watched Sam Parker become the kind of person I'd want to spend my life with. And now I know that Sam Parker was Sarah Whitmore all along." Sarah looked down at this good, honest man who was offering her everything she'd ever wanted: acceptance, love, belonging, and a future she could build without lies or deception. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, I'll marry you." As Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, the assembled riders erupted in cheers and applause. Even Marshal Harrison managed a grudging smile as he witnessed the transformation of a legal problem into a celebration. "Well," Tom Henderson called out, "I guess that makes her Sarah Sullivan soon enough. And anybody who wants to question Mrs. Sullivan's character can answer to all of us." The marshal shook his head in resignation. "I suppose there's no point in pursuing charges against someone who's about to become a respected member of the community. Consider this matter closed." As the crowd of supporters began to disperse, promising to spread word of the upcoming wedding throughout the territory, Sarah found herself alone on the porch with Jake for the first time since her identity had been revealed. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "Really sure? Because once we're married, there's no taking it back." Jake reached out and cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. "Sarah, I've been sure about you since the day you stared down Red Devil without flinching. I just didn't know your real name yet. And the baby will grow up knowing that their mother was brave enough to create a new life when the old one became impossible. That's not something to be ashamed of, that's something to be proud of." As the sun set over the Montana plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sarah felt the last pieces of her carefully constructed armor falling away. Sam Parker had served his purpose, had been the bridge between Sarah Whitmore's desperate flight and Sarah Sullivan's hopeful future. 3 years after arriving at a railroad station with nothing but lies and determination, she had found something. She'd never dared hope for a place where she could be strong and capable and valued for who she really was. A home where her child could grow up knowing the truth about courage and transformation. The woman who had once pretended to be a boy had discovered that the most powerful transformation of all was learning to be herself. 6 months later, November 1900, the first cry of Sarah Elizabeth Sullivan cut through the cold Montana air like a declaration of victory. In the bedroom of the Triple S ranch house, Surrounded by the women of the territory who had come to assist with the birth, Sarah held her daughter close and marveled at the miracle of new life. Jake stood beside the bed, his weathered face soft, with wonder as he looked down at his wife and child. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She's strong," Sarah corrected with a tired smile. "Just like her father, and just like her mother learned to be." Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, but inside the ranch house, everything was warm and golden and full of promise. The little girl who would grow up knowing that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is decide to become who you were always meant to be. And in the bunkhouse, Marcus raised a glass of whiskey in a quiet toast. "To Sam Parker," he said softly, "who taught us all that courage comes in many forms." The other men raised their glasses in agreement, honoring the memory of the young man who had never really existed, but whose legacy of hard work, determination, and quiet strength would live on in the woman who had created him and the family she had built from the ashes of her former life. Sometimes, the greatest transformations begin with the simple decision to refuse to give up. And sometimes the people who seem the most lost are actually the ones who are finding themselves for the very first time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.